I'm now an expert advisor to the new Independent Trade and Business Commission, that first meeting of which was today. And I spend my time, I suppose, insofar as I'm not spending my time being polite and saying how wonderful the government is doing on Twitter, which some of you will be aware of. I spend it thinking about UK trade policy and what we should do. Now, settle down a little bit on this. With apologies, this is going to be slightly long, because in thinking about trade policy, I wanted to actually do this properly and start from scratch about the way world trade works, the way it all sits together, before coming on to what the UK should do and whether that is in fact what the government is doing. So with apologies, this is going to take a little while, and then I believe there's time for questions or inquisition. I don't know how nice or testing you are of speakers, but please keep gentle. And I'll start then, and I'm going to start with geography, because geography is one of the few things that we can't change. And just as there was always a chance it was going to snow on the day the pubs reopened, geography, our vaccine supplies are intrinsically linked with Europe. And our relations with Europe have been the main factor in UK trade and international relations for, I would say, though I'm not an expert in all periods of history, 2,000 years. Never the only factor. I think it's fair to say that fondly for the last 500 years or so, we've looked west to new lands of freedom from Europe, and that's not Ireland. So thus was the US always our next most important relationship. But ultimately, right now, 70% of UK trade is with Europe or North America. And frankly, for most of history, most of our trade has been with Europe and the rest with North America. And that's both a fundamental point, and it's unsurprising looking at other economies. It doesn't tell us much to say we do more trade with our neighbours. Most countries do more trade with their neighbours. Now, what's to become of that after leaving the EU, I will discuss. But as I say, we need to start with, well, what is trade in the 21st century? Because we have to understand that distance still matters to trade, and tariffs largely don't. We also have to understand what it looks like with the rest of the world, and then I'll come back to our neighbourhood. And I have always set this out as I'm trying as best as I can to be from a neutral point of view. What should UK trade policy be, whether or not we are part of the EU? That's a political decision. We choose to be or not part of an organisation setting rules, and in turn we're subject to the institutions. We can choose not to be part of setting the rules, which we may still then be a party to, but then we won't be subject to the institutions, and that may come at a cost. Now, that's all known about being a part of the EU. But you can actually, in trade terms, you can not be part of the EU and still have a close relationship with Europe, or you can not be, or you can be part of the EU and try to have global Britain. They're not incompatible. They may be more difficult, but we have to, in my opinion, separate the questions of trade and politics. And I used to have some fun actually on social media, because some people who were the strongest backers of Brexit said, oh, the economics not a problem, we can trade around the world. And I said, well, all evidence is that's not going to be the case. They said, well, it's a political decision anyway. I said, well, you were the one who said it was going to be economically wonderful. I agree. It was a political decision. It shouldn't be made by people like myself, trade specialists. So separate choices. And nothing precludes global activity, but mostly you're always going to look at your own neighbourhood first, as we see most recently with vaccines. And frankly, as any sensible leader of a country knows. So let me move on to painting a picture of what trade looks like in the 21st century. And the important thing about this is it no longer looks like making a product like a car entirely from domestic components, or growing some vegetables and selling them to another country. Now, of course, that happens, but it's a distinct minority of trade. We are in an era of supply chains. We're in an era of 30,000 components from around the world going into a car, or ingredients from vaccines going around around Europe, or some appear to come from America. In fact, we're not quite sure where all the ingredients come for all our vaccines, which is one of the problems we've had in trying to understand what's happening with AZ and Pfizer's shortages. And that hasn't really sufficiently been understood, I think, by enough people, particularly those making decisions or reporting trade in the media. So what we see, for those of us looking at international trade, is we see multinationals who are picking their content from around the world to make a final product for the consumer. We see a widget maker supplying an engine maker, supplying a car manufacturer, a chain of production. We see entire systems of production and services around Formula One cars, or the English Premier League, or leading universities, all of which, by the way, are huge sources of trade income for the UK, which is very rarely reported. We see the audit and quality systems going alongside systems of production, and even the agricultural producers reliant on technology to optimize what they're growing, which is why the Netherlands is now the world's second largest exporter of agricultural products. Trade is no longer particularly obvious. So new products, new services, we have goods sold as services. We have a hugely complex system run, insofar as anybody is running it, by supply chain managers in Tesco or their counterparts. And if you think I'm joking, I said that to somebody who runs an industry body for supply chain experts in the UK, and I said, well, you run the world, and he said, yes, I think we probably do. So no false modesty there. The logistics managers, the supply chain managers, are hugely influential in modern trade. It's almost got to the point, actually, it's too complex to understand, and there is a problem with that, but that's not for today. Now, much of this change, because it used to be the case that much greater proportion of trade was about selling finished products, whereas now it's about intermediates. Much of this change has happened since 1990, and what's it down to really is mostly technology, cheap transport of people and data, open economies. China's risen at the same time, but this didn't all happen because of China. China did place themselves very well to take advantage of it. Now, from super tankers in the Suez to vaccine wars, this all has pretty profound consequences, not least for the nation state, and we're only just learning about them. But I think there's no doubt in my mind that this global trade has led to a sense of domestic dislocation in many developed countries. That led to some of the votes in 2016, the Brexit vote and the Trump vote. And one of the major things about global trade is the lack of political control over the economy now. Governments can help by ensuring a skilled population or good infrastructure, maybe a little bit of state aid and assistance for key companies, even if that's not always in line with the rules. Some predictable rules and regulations such as business acts, but none of that actually guarantees success. It doesn't guarantee that the local factory, which is part of a supply chain, will stay open. And I've personally seen in my hometown the times when production has just stopped because they want to move the plant to somewhere nearer to another plant. So you've got this loss of influence by the government on the economy. And none of this really, by the way, talks to free trade agreements, which is probably what you thought I was going to talk a lot about. I will come back to them, but free trade agreements, which primarily reduce the taxes on imported goods, the tariffs, they seem to be a different world, because tariffs have been low for 30 years. That's why all these goods are zipping around the world. Another important thing about this is that those container-laden ships, which appear to show that everything is coming from China, actually disguise the fact that most production is arranged regionally. Companies know the risk of relying on uncertain transport over long distance for key production. In fact, even more surprising is when you discover that the UK is still making just as much as we ever did, just with a lot less people, because of automation. So the economy looks different to the way it's reported. And a final point to all of this global trade activity, because there is going to be the inevitable question, or there should be, but why are we doing all of this trade? Why are products zipping around the world? Why are services being combined in this way? Consumers have got the benefit of greater choice and lower price than ever before. That is true. supply chains and technology mean we can get more or less whatever we want delivered next day. That's great. It's just it might work against the thriving high street or your local factory or whatever. Those are the way that things have developed. Now that's the world we have to fit into, and the UK has to fit into. So the next bit, the next part of the puzzle is, again, not an obvious one, and that is that there's been a domestic change in all developed countries, just as important, though taking place over a slightly longer timescale. And that's the rise of what I call the regulated state, to the extent that virtually every product and service is subject to various government rules about it being sold in different countries. And modern trade has to navigate those regulations, which may be in anything from safe electrical products, holes in pen lids, to rules for opening a bank. And to do business internationally, to trade, you have to follow the rules, at least in most trades. There are some trades, I won't discuss them much, which don't have to follow the rules. Some of them are legal, having said which, you may not like them, like armaments or energy actually follows a different set of rules, things bought by public authorities. But by and large, for most goods that we're concerned with, there are going to be different rules and regulations, which are different between countries. So an importer of electrical equipment to the EU can self-declare that their product is safe, whereas in the US, it would have to be tested by an independent and approved third party. Chemicals in the EU, on the other hand, must comply with pretty stringent regulations, while US laws are far more lax. And we could go on, we could compare the UK, the US, the EU, even China, India, and Brazil are all increasingly getting into regulated products and services. But this all leads to the non-tariff barriers, which are referred to now occasionally, in which the Prime Minister very briefly and incorrectly claimed to have abolished with the EU at the end of last year in his trade and cooperation agreement. And these non-tariff barriers are so diverse and complex that we struggle to measure them. And so important, as we see from the UK and the EU, that continuing with tariff-free trade hasn't avoided a mountain of paperwork being introduced on trade from January the 1st. And in part, it is quite difficult to grasp all of these. Tariffs are quite an easy concept to grasp. It's money. It just doesn't mean that much. So tariffs, the fact that if we go get a tariff-free deal with Australia, wine might be cheaper because it would remove the tariff of, wait for it, 13 pence per litre. But that 13 pence needs to be set against all the forms that need to be filled in, or indeed, in that case, the £3.50 of duty and VAT on a £7.50 bottle of wine. But there's the forms, there's the labels, there's the product testing, and that's the case for all of them. And wine has quite a high tariff by comparison to many products. And given all of those non-tariff barriers, it's no wonder that large businesses find those easier to navigate than small. Some of you will be aware of a wine merchant who is listing out all the forms he has to fill in to bring in wine now from France, and there have been shellfish sellers who have listed all of their paperwork to sell now into France. And that paperwork is normal around the world. The EU is the exception for not requiring it internationally. A lot of this is always going to be about goods. We talk more about goods than services, even though the UK is really good at services. I'm going to come back to services, but there is a kind of equivalent to tariffs, which is the right for UK companies to establish in other markets and sell to their consumers. It's worth having, but like zero tariffs, it's rather limited in effect. Because again, in services trade, as for goods, it's much less about whether you can, in theory, set up and sell in another country, but what rules and regulations you have to meet in order to do so. And in the case of major multinationals, again, they find it easier. They'll set up subsidiaries or they'll have various tax accounting. It's much harder if you're a small business wanting to, I don't know, sell architectural services into another country. And so we get to the point of saying modern international trade, this really isn't simple. We'd really like, from a trade perspective, to ensure that all UK products and services that meet our rules can be sold anywhere in the world. But we had that with Europe, and we decided we didn't like it, so we moved out. we had that, so we had free trade and we got rid of it, which I tend to find amusing about the so-called pro-free market think tanks in the UK, all of which, when pushed, chose sovereignty, as in leaving the EU, over the free trade that we in fact have. And that leaves us then to have to negotiate away regulatory problems individually, if we want to make it better. In some cases, there are global norms and global standards which help. There are, in some of the cutting edge areas like online services, there are fewer rules, so it's less clear what they might be. And the UK, there may be areas the UK is quite good at. But mostly all of these rules and regulations were introduced for good reasons, like health and safety, or environmental protection or labour protection, and also influenced by incumbents to suit themselves. So it's not easy to remove barriers to trade, and that's why there are so many differences between different countries in terms of their regulations. A final point really on regulations. Where there are regulatory norms globally, quite a lot of them are set by the EU through what's become known as the Brussels effect. And this is the concept that companies need to meet the highest regulatory level in a large market, or they have to pay for that. And that typically is the one in the EU, and then they lobby other governments to change their own rules or accept EU rules accordingly, because it saves them money to do so, or they may impose it through their supply chains. So the Brussels effect is one reason why the UK may end up following EU regulations even after leaving. So, in a nutshell, in about 15 minutes, that's much of modern trade, value chains, differing regulations. So, let's move now more specifically onto the UK, and how much does all of this influence UK trade policy? Well, it doesn't really. It doesn't take you an awful lot of effort to look at ministerial statements that put tariffs first, departure from European regulatory agencies without considering the consequences, or the priority given to free trade agreements with countries on the other side of the world, which have no obvious value. Now, it's not actually an easy question. There's no particularly good answers that anyone has as to what to do with global trade trends. The EU is focusing on enforcement and a new form of industrial policy. Under President Biden, the US seems to be mostly focusing on how they can get factory jobs of the 1950s back, both of which look to be a little bit problematic. People are only just identifying the problems of modern trade, of global value chains. They're still working out what to do about it. So we're not the only ones struggling. Now, I've described the UK government's main approach as being that they seem to be taking inspiration from their student days, perhaps, and embarking on a gap year to Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. So the priorities being those two previously mentioned trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, plus joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP for only just a little bit shorter. Now, there are actually good reasons for doing those. They're just not particularly trade-related reasons. In the case of Australia and New Zealand, there's some mixture going on here. We may be making up a bit for 1973 because people still seem to be upset that we cut Australia and New Zealand's imports a bit when we joined the EEC, or common market. We may be practicing trade agreements. We may be encouraging an Anglosphere, building alliances, or using them as a gateway to joining the CPTPP. Because from a UK point of view, there are a few obvious problems identified in these markets beyond them being a very long way away. And for Australia and New Zealand, it's really about locking in preferential terms for their agricultural products. Now, the CPTPP is a slightly different matter. It's a group of 11 countries, although at the moment it's only 7, as 4 countries haven't in fact ratified the agreement, and we're not quite sure if they will. There are some barriers to UK exports, though most of them are in one country that has yet to ratify, Malaysia, because we actually have trade deals with most of the rest, or will have. But there's a bigger problem, and you may notice this, that I've been talking about supply chains and regulations. And CPTPP quite obviously does very little for supply chains because it's based around the Pacific Basin. So is a supply chain for a product, for a car, really going to be based around Southeast Asia or the Pacific and the UK? We're geographically wrong for that. It doesn't mean it definitely won't happen, but it's not likely to be a big gain from it. And particularly in services, regulatory barriers are scarcely addressed either in CPTPP. It might help us develop some new trade relationships, and trade deals are never completely without value. I mean, that's what we used to spend our time on before Brexit, is thinking about trade deals, even if they only had a small amount of value, they help. But that's some way short of the excitable lines we see from government-friendly media. Again, there's other reasons for CPTPP. Those promoting it in the UK, there's two reasons. One of which is not so helpful, and one of which is quite amusing in a way. So those promoting it in the UK, some of whom think it's a gateway to a US trade deal, in that it moves us away from EU regulatory norms, particularly in food, although it's not really clear if it does. And this was something that was said around Whitehall a couple of years ago, is that if we join the CPTPP, then by the back door we'll accept US food standards and then we'll do a US trade deal. So that was said, though I'm not sure it's true. Others have a belief that the UK has to be in some kind of a club of countries, and if it isn't the EU, the next best on offer is the CPTPP. And that's not completely wrong, because key allies have shared that view exactly. Japan in particular supports UK accession to CPTPP as a sign that we're going to take global rules seriously, and we're not planning to abandon them in some kind of isolationist fit after Brexit. And in the same sort of way, we see the new US administration emphasize NATO as well as the EU and visit Brussels all the time, as NATO obviously includes the UK. So our allies actually did have concerns that Brexit was less global Britain and more nationalism, and didn't want it to go further. Brexit was a shock to them. So, and if through CPTPP our allies have to pretend to be impressed by global Britain, for them that's a small price to pay. When you speak to serious trade officials in Australia or the US or Japan, they know the UK's trade story is going to be predominantly about Europe and North America. No harm in trying to increase trade globally, but it's hardly the first priority. So let's now start to sort of head back to Europe and what we should actually be doing. As you'll gather, I don't think it's Southeast Asia. Trade's not a binary choice. You get good in local markets and then look to expand globally, or you bring a product from distant markets and look to take it to other local markets. University students and tourists can come from anywhere. People watch the Premier League around the world. But there is a gravity effect in trade, which is that you do more trade closer to your country. And there are good reasons for that. We travel more easily and often to our neighbours, at least we do in normal times. We can get to know them better, know how to sell to them. We can resolve difficulties more easily. Transportation of goods is cheaper and more reliable. Culture is closer, even if language is different. I think that's one of the things that often surprises people about the UK and Europe as compared to the US. We speak roughly the same language as the US, but culturally we are closer to European. And major companies largely focus and manage their production regionally, whether that's car makers or pharmaceutical manufacturers. There'll be a Europe branch of the company or a Europe and Middle East division. I never heard of a UK and New Zealand division of a company. That's not the way that companies organize their production, their structures. We often hear that Europe's declining and the East is rising. Now, typically, if you look at the figures, most of that's usually made up of China, but there has been some strong growth in the likes of South Korea and Vietnam. But that doesn't mean that Europe ceases to be a large market, a market we know well, as compared to say, China. And if you want to compete in China, so does the rest of the world. It's not going to be easy. And as I say, if we don't want just to focus on Europe, we tend to then focus on North America. which is another market reducing in size relative to China, though we don't tend to hear that so much as we do about Europe. And I just think that the EU and the US are going to remain our base markets for so many of these reasons. In trade terms, the US and the EU have some quite serious differences, which means we'll have to make some choices. I'd already mentioned the EU regulatory system. There are those who would have us get closer to that of the US, bring their food into the UK. It wouldn't, as it happens, make it any easier for UK food to be exported to the US, so it doesn't look like a particularly good deal for the UK. But I am always told by friends in the trade policy community that we do spend too much of our time talking about exports, so we should also talk about imports and making imports easier. I'm still not convinced that making imports of US food easier is what UK trade policy should be about, but it's not all about exports. And in fact, major US multinationals would rather we had a close relationship with the EU than a trade deal with the US. For the same reason as I mentioned earlier, they see the UK as part of the European, not the North American supply chain. But if we choose political reasons not to get closer to the EU, it's going to be a closeness with the US. We are, realistically, that is the kind of choice. And I suspect we're going to oscillate a little bit between the two. And it'll play out a little bit as much of Brexit does in Northern Ireland, which has to follow EU rules. So Northern Ireland doesn't get the chlorinated chicken under the protocol. And there's heavier checks on Great British food if we have chlorinated chicken here. And I suspect that might be enough to swing it away from a US trade deal and towards the EU, because if we have a food deal with the EU, less checks on Great Britain to Northern Ireland produce. But that one is still to play out. In any case, I've now gone on quite a long time, so I'm now going to wrap up with my suggested kind of way forward, what I would like to see. This isn't unfortunately what the government is going to be doing, but we live in hope. Yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to bring together the markets, the regulations, the value chains. The UK economy as it stands, we don't hear so much about that. We have some strengths, plenty of services, some complex manufacturing, defense. We have skills. We participate in supply chain, European global supply chains, Rolls-Royce engines, Airbus wings, Citibanks. We also actually succeeded in replicating most existing EU trade agreements, though in Europe these have been downgraded because our EU relationship was downgraded, and that affects relations with Turkey, Switzerland and Norway in particular, who are another sizable chunk of UK trade. But we have strengths, and the UK economy is not about to immediately fall off a cliff, even if it faces challenges. We're also, the people on this listening would not thank me for this, but we're not imminently about to rejoin the EU, I'm afraid, the single market or the customs union. Yeah, it's, even if that becomes an issue in the future, it isn't one now. So that's not going to happen. Most of us are less keen than Brexit enthusiasts to keep fighting the 2016 referendum as well. We want to move on, and do so in a sensible fashion. So what does that look like? And I think the first thing for me is to move away from the rather obscure notions of regulatory sovereignty, particularly where there's no known value in divergence. So it would start for me with membership of Europe-wide bodies such as the European Aviation Safety Authority. Aviation safety, it strikes me, is not an issue of sovereignty. And the idea of leaving that body, I thought, had to be a low point of the UK government last year, where we did, we want aviation safety to be British. It's global. It always should be, and the European agency has plenty of non-EU member states in it. And retaining our place in regional supply chains is going to mean moving away from the idea, at least in goods, of nimble regulation, which companies don't actually want, towards predictability and global norms. I already mentioned that in food and drink, it would help considerably in reducing barriers between Great Britain and Northern Ireland under the protocol. It will also help small and medium enterprises who have fewer sales on which to offset higher compliance costs from non-tariff barriers, and are more likely to look to nearby markets as they have less ability to try to service more distant markets. So we really need to look to help smaller businesses. That helps our economy, and you do that by having a closer relationship with your neighbours. Government should also be giving special priority to tackling the problems of SMEs anyway in other markets, rather than spending all of their efforts lobbying for multinationals. And I've seen this in government, where governments say to small businesses, well, you'll get the benefit, the general benefits, but they won't, we're not actually going to look at your specific issues. And I think that they need to be looked at. And that includes, I think, one of those that I've looked at that I've had a number of people talking to me about, the many skilled self-employed who are used to working with hindrance around Europe. And I think that is one of the biggest issues that has yet to hit us, because obviously of COVID, but that is something we need to be looking at as a priority. As a services superpower in trade terms, which we are, the largest second largest exporter in the world, we should probably have more scope there actually for divergence and finding our own path. But before we do that, there's one step that we can do that I think almost all trade specialists, including some of the most passionate Brexiteers, agree would do more for UK services trade than anything else that we could possibly do, which is to abolish the Home Office. Sadly, it's not going to happen, but it is the department that makes it as difficult and as expensive as possible for foreigners, many of whom want to spend money here and do business here, to visit, including at times those invited to trade meetings arranged by other parts of the government. We really have to resolve making it easier for people to come and do business here, to lower the costs, reduce the horrendous bureaucracy. And that is something we can do. We don't need any assistance at all, and it potentially can make a big difference. It's not going to happen, I don't think, and I have the scars of that from 10 years ago in government. I think beyond that, and joking aside, we really have to try to do something in the space of immigration policy. A longer shot that the UK should be considering in services. Traditional trade agreements do address services trade pretty badly, not reflecting the complex regulatory landscape. And I would be very interested in exploring a different approach to that and trying to find a more open kind of services trade agreement, which said we will allow our companies from other countries to provide services where they like in this country, as long as we can in their country, and basically open that up to whoever is willing. And a good start would be the likes of New Zealand or Australia. It wouldn't initially lead to a lot of extra work, but it's something that could be built up. And it's the sort of thing that, if you study that sort of, look to that kind of approach, that's why you want to wait to do your trade deal with New Zealand or Australia, because we want to ask for something in return for their agricultural market access. And it probably is something to do with services. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't fully kind of scoped out how it might work, but we should be doing something more in services, in trying to encourage greater trade in something we're good at. I also think that we should be going further than anybody else has gone before in trade around climate change, environment, animal welfare. Global trade rules are actually pretty ambiguous in this respect as to whether WTO members can take action to restrict imports which are produced to lower levels of environmental protection, or they use more antibiotics in animals or pesticides. And I think that the UK should be taking steps here. We know it's something that should be done. I don't actually particularly want to see special protection given to UK farmers, but I think they should be given equal protection, that the rules that they have to follow should also apply to imports. A little bit controversial, that one, in global trade terms, but that there's an opportunity there for us, I think, and that would be in line with what people want to see, I think, what consumers want to see. And talking about global trade rules, we hear talk occasionally of the UK being a leader in trade liberalisation at the WTO. I don't think it means very much as the government states it. I think it's fine for the UK to support global trade rules. I don't have great ambitions at the WTO beyond that. Governance of global institutions is pretty difficult at the moment, and being a supporter would be quite sufficient. We have to be fair to the government. They've joined the group of supportive WTO members, which is known as the Ottawa Group. That's a good thing, and let's just carry on in that way. We need to focus on rebuilding European trade ties, not just the EU, but all European countries, rejoining the cross-European regulatory agencies, as I already started to mention, but also boosting our lobbying and trade diplomacy efforts, because we have exporters suffering problems now. And there will be EU plans which affect our future trade with them. And we've spent 5 years insulting EU member states, basically, and insulting and ignoring most of them. And that's left us a bit isolated in our own neighborhood. That can't be good. We, apart from the US, all of our next biggest trading partners are European, and we need to be urgently rebuilding ties, because that will pay dividends. Not just we should do it anyway, it is a good thing to do in our neighborhood, but we should also do it because it will pay. You know, when we hear about goods stuck at customs or whatever, I remember speaking to a MEP who was an MEP in 1990, who said that most of their time at that time was spent in dealing with problematic cases where goods got stuck at customs. Well, we need to have that again, because we've got those problems arising again. And at the moment, it doesn't look like we're ready to deal with them. And so you note after all of that, that about my fifth priority, I finally mentioned free trade agreements. They can have value in cementing relationships and establishing rules, but they're really not a priority anymore for anybody, and they shouldn't be. Free ports, areas free of tariffs around the country, which the government is very excited on, frankly look like just an anachronism from days when tariffs mattered. It's very hard to see. I mean, there's enterprise zones, there's special tax zones, there's lots of incentives on offer, but it really doesn't look like something that should be the centerpiece of a modern trade policy. There's much more to be said for President Biden's belief that FTAs actually deliver very little of economic value, and that's why the US isn't looking to pursue them at the moment, including with the UK. I still think there might be a UK-US trade deal, even if moving away from EU regulation in food looks like a notion pushed by lobbyists for US agri-food businesses with no great benefit for the UK. I would much rather focus on the areas we agree with the US in trade. They're the largest services exporter in the world. We're second, so I'd much rather we did something about services than argued about chlorinated chicken. That's my view. And I think we also should be careful about giving full access to agriculture from agricultural exporters like the US, because we need to maintain meaningful import preferences for developing country food, and that should be part of our story as well. We have to have a fair trade policy. And in an ideal world, none of this precludes strengthening our trade with the likes of, well, China might be a bit tricky, but India, South America, and elsewhere. We are probably going to lose a little bit of trade with Europe as a result of higher trade barriers. There will be some adjustment. We do need to look for new markets, but there's no inconsistency between doing that and looking to strong relations with Europe. Yeah, there'll be an evolution, and over time, that might lead to some changes. And I just see that as a better approach than chasing free trade agreements for no particularly good reason. I've said enough. That is all terribly optimistic, because we have a government fixated on free trade agreements and not regulation, on glamour trips to India and not on reforming the Home Office. There is a potential path there for a future trade policy that's outside the EU, but deals with Europe in a mature, grown-up fashion. We don't actually need to be part of a bloc to survive. You may want to be part of a bloc, but we don't have to be. But we have to be smarter. We have to understand the world as it is. We don't, I promised actually I was not going to mention the 19th century. Every UK minister's speech seems to start by mentioning Ricardo and the theory of comparative advantage. I'd kind of like to take our trade policy out of 1830 and bring it into 2020, or at least 2000, or sometime like that. I suspect that's optimistic. I think we will learn, but it might take time. And with that, I shall pause. And with apologies, that was rather long, but hopefully of interest.